everyone, and welcome to our Tech Tip webinar for the month of February 2010. Today we're going to be continuing along the lines of talking about our new features for GL Studio 4.1. The feature we're going to be talking about today are our animated schematics plugins. We have two. We have our Polyline Interconnect and our Team Interconnect. We're going to go ahead and talk about how they're used inside GL Studio to create a what you see is what you get interface for creating animated schematics that you can actually see the results directly in the editor and actually manipulate the flow directly within the editor. Before we get started with that, though, the animated schematics rely heavily on textures. In order to access those textures, we've actually created a nice little pack of starter textures for our users to use. If you sign into the GL Studio support site, which I have up on my screen now, looking at the GL Studio 4.1 download section of the support site, the very first entry up here is a bonus content pack preview. Downloading this content pack will give you access to all the objects that were in the old GL Studio 4.0 bonus pack, as well as a extra set of schematics textures. And these are the textures that are within that pack. We're going to be using one of these textures here inside the demo. After seeing one, you'll get a very good idea of how the others would actually work out. So feel free to sign on to the support site at your leisure. Go ahead and download this pack, and this will give you a bunch of good textures to get started with using the actual animated schematics plugin. So now that we've looked at that, we're actually going to go ahead and develop a just a really small, really simple application using the animated schematics. I'm going to go ahead and delete my wizard created group. And the first thing we're going to do is start with our Polyline Interconnect. The Polyline Interconnect tool allows us to create a set, or pretty much create like a set of tubes similar to the way the polyline works. Just as a refresher, in order to use a polyline, we would first click once to establish our starting point. So I'll set it right here towards the middle of the screen. At that point, we get our line. This line is then used. We can go ahead and click and set vertices for our specific object. And what we're going to see here as I create this object, the actual curvature of the application itself is going to be kind of using splines. You'll see this as I finish up. I'm going to go ahead and draw a very simple interface. So we'll go back out to here. And then let's say we have just some kind of a little curvature. We'll go ahead and set that. One thing you'll notice is it's very easy to actually draw up schematics. Once we've actually finished with this, we're going to see that all the individual vertices we're placing are going to go ahead and fill in. The actual width of the objects themselves is going to be variable depending, or is something that we can actually set in object properties. We can actually see that I made a mistake in my object here. We're going to be able to actually fix that as well, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. So I'll go ahead and finish this up really quick. Go ahead and draw it down. And then the very last point to finish up, we just do a double click. And we can see our Polyline Interconnect object's been drawn. The first thing we're going to notice here is this one's actually pretty thick. So the first thing I'm going to do, in order to see the actual characteristics that are unique, especially to the Polyline Interconnect, I'm going to go ahead and group my object properties by class. This is a very useful thing to do when you're just getting used to a new plugin. Doing this, we can actually see all of our common things for display object, which are the properties that are present with any particular object that is derived from display object. And then looking down further, we actually have our GLS Schematic Polyline Interconnect section. These are all the new features specific to the Polyline, and these are what we're going to want to look at. The first one we see is our line thickness. I'm going to go ahead and set that down to about 5. And we see the line thins up a lot, and it makes it a lot easier for us to see and work with. So we'll go ahead and leave it just like that. Now, as I mentioned, I kind of made a mistake down in here. In order to fix that, if we go to vertex mode, for our specific object, we'll be able to see, there we go. Not only do we see the vertices, but we also see the splines from the individual corners. Grabbing the corners and actually manipulating them, we can actually see how the spline kind of affects how the curvature of the shape, or the curvature of each vertex of our Polyline Interconnect works. So we've got two vertices we want to fix here. I'm just going to go ahead and just nudge them down. And by the way, with creating schematics just like this, it's highly recommended to leave the grid on. Of course, that's true with most any kind of precision drawing, but that's especially true inside animated schematics, especially if this is one of those things where you'll have a system already created where you kind of lay a polygon in the backdrop, paste a texture of that system on the backdrop, and then kind of draw the animated schematic around that system just so you can kind of create an interactive system based off of that drawing. So we've got this, we've got our entire thing finished. It's really, really simple schematic. The next thing we're going to want to do is go ahead and change the textures. I'm going to go ahead and rework my window a little bit so we can see our object properties. Here we go. So if we look down inside Schematic Polyline Interconnect, the first thing we're going to notice is we have two settings for textures. One of them is known as the Interconnect Texture, and the other one is the Flow Texture. The Interconnect Texture is going to be the background of the object itself. It's not the flow, but it's the section that surrounds the flow. We'll be able to see that. I'll go ahead and apply a texture to PNG file, which this Interconnect PNG file was part of our bonus pack. We'll go ahead and select that and hit Open and apply that texture. And you can see now that the Interconnect kind of applies its way all the way around the animated schematic, and it makes this thing look more like a tube instead of the black shadow that it used to be. So now that we've done this, the next thing we can do is actually apply the flow texture. Now I just use the air-cool flow. All these schematics, you can use these to represent a number of different things. Airflow, fluid flow. We have a couple of things to represent voltage. There are a number of different uses for this. I'm sure many of you out there have your own ideas for a way that you could use this tool. So we've applied the flow texture, and we can see that in the editor, the texture is actually animating. This is actually what's so great about the Animated Schematics plugin. This isn't something where we have to kind of draw it up and then compile it and then run it and then hope it looks the way we want it to. With this particular plugin, we've actually built up the whole thing, and we can actually see it running inside the editor so that we can verify the look and feel and make any changes. For example, if I think that's too thin, I can go ahead and adjust the line thickness up to 8, for instance. And we see the effect inside the editor in real time. So that's the Polyline Interconnect. We have another plugin as well, the T Interconnect. The T Interconnect is created a little bit differently. If we click and hold once, we actually get a base object drawn. And then what we can do here is just kind of drag to create the initial size of the object. When you're using a T, that's actually supposed to be connected to a polyline object, or a polyline interconnect. Like if you're creating schematics or creating a T for an existing polyline, it's a good idea to try to make it fit as close to so we'll go ahead and do that. The first thing we have to do, of course, is since the thickness was adjusted on the left and the right side, we're going to want to do that here. We notice with the T interconnect we have many, many more options, and that's because we can actually impact the base, the left side, and the right side all individually of each other. So the left line thickness, we need to set that down to 8. The right line thickness we'll also set down to 8. And then just for the sake of demonstration, we'll go ahead and leave the baseline thickness right at 10. The left interconnect texture is going to be our interconnect. Same thing for the right and the base. And then we'll go ahead and do the same thing for our flow texture, set that same airflow, the airflow texture we were using for a polyline. Now as I actually paste or draw this up into the scene, there's a couple things that we're going to notice. The first one, and probably the most obvious, is that our flow by default, it looks like it flows up into the base and then out both the left and the right side. Obviously this isn't correct for the case that this flow moves towards the T, not away from it. But of course once we reach our break where the polyline stops and the T begins, we can actually see it kind of flowing into each other, kind of colliding here at the end of the right side. To fix that, we're going to go ahead and change the flow rate for the right side. We notice right now it's a positive value, If we want to make it flow the opposite way, all we need to do is just set it as a negative value. And we see that setting the negative flow, it now flows in the correct direction. A couple of other things to note as far as different things we can actually set inside our object. I'm going to go ahead and apply these just to the base so that we can actually see what some of these features do. As I drag my T back up. The repeat length is essentially the period between where the texture starts and stops. So the smaller this value is, that's the interconnect repeat length. Let's go to the flow repeat length. We'll actually be able to see something. We see the smaller this value is, the more compacted all the different, or the more compacted the texture is. So it flows a lot more often. If we set this to a larger number, we see a lot larger flow. This is typically more of something you'd probably see as opposed to these much smaller units. You probably see larger units like this. This is how you'd actually go about setting them using the repeat length. Should for some reason you want your object to blink, we do have the blinking option, which is present in all GeoStudio polygons. We can actually make this affect the base, left side and the right side. We notice that we actually have end colors for these objects as well. Setting the end color for the blink obviously changes the color it blinks to. So you may find use for that. Going through, there's really not a whole lot more to this. Remember, the main keys to using this tool makes it a lot easier to actually see schematics at runtime. It allows you to pretty much build up an entire schematic or a system without having to worry about the math involved with modulating a texture, which is what you would have had to do before. Essentially place a texture on an object and then move the texture coordinates of it so that it does the repeating. We're doing all this for you now, and we're actually doing it so you can actually see it in the editor without having the need to constantly recompile, recheck your code, make sure everything is looking exactly the way you want it to. So this was a very brief overview of this new feature of GeoStudio 4.1. So with that, we kind of stopped a little early today. The webinar only lasted about 10 minutes, but that's because really everything we did today was inside the editor. There's really no reason to go to code. So if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask them. I'll go ahead and leave the webinar going for about 5 minutes. Okay, I actually have a question here regarding the actual joint between the T object and the schematic. Let me go ahead and zoom in so everyone can see exactly what we're referring to here. Zooming in directly on this joint, we see that there is actually a very, very noticeable divide between the two individual plugins. The question is, can this joint be eliminated? And the answer to that question is yes. The reason we're seeing this kind of a overlap is simply because the texture is not reaching the end of one side before it begins the other. Actually, the question there is the answer there, let me go ahead and zoom back out now that I accidentally zoomed in. The answer to that question is to try to line it up so that the end of one period begins the period of the other, and that joint will just go away. Let's go ahead and take a look at this and see if we can pull this off. The first thing to do, I know I recommended turning the grid on for lining this thing up. To do any kind of very in-depth, minute editing, I recommend turning the grid off because now we're going to have to go pixel by pixel to kind of line this thing up. Selecting the Polyline Interconnect and going to vertex mode, we see that the end vertex for this for the polyline actually extends well into the T. Adjusting it, we're going to see that we can get closer and closer. Eventually, the closer you get, the more that joint disappears. So, assuming my dexterity is up to par, let's see. Looks like we've got that just about where we want it. The periods are lining up. Now, the last little joint we see a little bit of white there. That's actually the end of the T interconnect with the polyline extending behind it. If we put the polyline in front, that should go away. So we'll select the T interconnect. We're going to go ahead and send that to the back. Looks like we're going to have to do a little bit more tinkering. but we can already see a noticeable difference. Takes a little bit of lining up to make it work, but once you've done that, the end result is that this will go away. So we'll go ahead and keep tinkering with that for just a couple minutes, but that is how you would do it. The important thing to note here is that the end of one texture should begin at another one. If your Polyline Interconnect is significantly away from one to the other, you can actually see a lot more of a divide between one side and the other side. So we see it ending here, and then a significant time later it begins on the other side. So the trick is to get it lined up as closely as you can. It lines up correctly. Once you do that, the actual break that you see will start to go away. So I hope that I answered the question here. Thank you for tuning in today. We'll see you back here next month. Take care, everyone.